Hello, thank you for being here. Ian Worley. I run the user experience and design team on the institutional side at Morgan Stanley, where I've been for the last few years. I don't have any slides, so you're going to have to just listen to me, unfortunately. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my own experience, certainly over the last 5 years, about sort of how, this is really kind of freaking me out, it's a bit too loud, about how we consistently deliver great UX inside of a large organization, particularly inside of a large bank, which, as you can imagine, has its challenges. But I'll start with a little bit of a background about me. So I've spent the majority of my career in design and user experience on the agency and consulting side, everything from sort of small startups and doing small kind of very simple systems, from SMS-driven content delivery systems to designing entire businesses from the customer side in. And after a fairly long career, I decided in 2010 to join Morgan Stanley, partly because I wanted to see what it was like to be on the client side, partly because actually there was a certain intrinsic frustration working as a consultant that you do come up with great ideas, you lead people down a great path, you have something, and then at some point projects, the easier projects get done, but there's a sense in which things quite often don't go exactly the way you want them to, or they kind of have a first burst into light, and then they sort of fade very quickly after that. And there's a real sense of all the effort that you put into these things not being able to be sustained inside of these organizations. And so I wanted a new challenge to see if I could maybe perhaps gain a little bit more control over how the things that I spent my energy on actually grew. So I joined Morgan Stanley ostensibly to run the Matrix team, which was their award-winning, we actually won an award here in 2011, award-winning single dealer platform, and also then to build their European UX group. So just to give you some context, Morgan Stanley is a company of 60,000 employees, 16,000 IT people and developers. There are about 35 of us now. There were only about 10 or 15 when I started. So just in terms of the proportions of the number of people that we have to influence and affect, given our relative scale, there's quite a lot of weight of inertia that we have to deal with. So as you can imagine, it was a bit of a shock to the system. So having been a person who was known, brought in by companies as a consultant, what they're actually essentially saying to you is, we want your services, come in and help us. When you're on the inside, you're just a guy with a team and just one more employee inside a hierarchy that may or may not have any relevant experience. No one will have read your CV. No one knows anything about you. Most of them have no clue about what design is. So you walk into a room kind of filled to the brim with your own 20 years of experience, expecting people to listen when you say it should be like this, and they look at you and go, nah, we're doing this. And you hit that a few times, and you sort of go, okay, this is a different kind of world. So how do I figure this out? So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how certainly I've gone on a journey of trying to figure that out. But I want to start with a slightly different story from a different part of my career, which may seem completely unrelated, but I feel it kind of captures the heart of sort of what I've done and the way I approach the problem. So before I began doing user experience in the early 90s, I was an architect here in New York. I used to do private homes for very wealthy clients, and who often have a very assertive position about what they would like to do, with or without taste. So I had a client who came to me and said, so I would like you to design me a colonial red brick house with 4 columns and a circular driveway. At which point my response to him was, why are you hiring an architect? You should go get yourself a developer and off you go. And he was sort of taken aback, and he said, no, but I have to have an architect. And I said, well, okay, if we can have an architect, then let's step back a couple of steps here. Let's talk about why you want a colonial house. What does that mean? And what you realize very quickly, and I was probably 23 or 4 at the time, what you realize very quickly is that, of course, this person is doing his best to articulate in a way which makes him feel competent what he imagines his future house to be. But not having any of the language of design, the language of architecture, he's kind of making a stab at something which somehow reflects what he imagines his life will be like when he's moved into this new house. And so you know, and in a way, it's sort of how I kind of discovered user-centered design, because of course the first process is you begin to ask people not what house do they want, but what life do they want to live? You know, how do they live their lives? And how do you then, as an architect, facilitate through building, which is not unlike designing software. And there's a particular instance which I think really crystallized it for me. So this particular client had grown up in India and was, I wouldn't say he was poor, but he certainly wasn't as wealthy as he was by the time he was in New York. And he grew up in a small village and sort of made his own way. He'd moved to Amsterdam, was selling clothes off of the side of a truck or something, and eventually wound up, you know, building a global clothing company. And so in trying to sort of get at the heart of who this person was, I'd asked him stories about his childhood back in India, the sort of those moments in his life that were the most meaningful to him, that when he sort of thought about himself or he thought about things that made him feel good, what were the things that he returned to again and again. And one of them was he always talked about how he missed the stars. That living in New York, living in the West, living in cities, he can't ever see the stars. And as a child, the thing that fascinated him the most was lying out in the fields and looking up and looking at the amazing stars, and it still to this day kind of brought tears to his eyes. So we were designing his house, and he had asserted that once we'd gotten past the colonial things, this just shows you how mercurial these things can be, the house had morphed from being a colonial four-column thing to being a Richard Neutra style, you know, 2 flat planes with glass all the way around, which works really well in a flat 2.2 acre suburban site where everyone gets to look at you. Works great on a cliff overlooking the sea, not so great when you're surrounded by other houses. And in particular, he had a bedroom, which he decided that when he went to bed, he wanted all the walls to be glass. Well, obviously, except for the one that used the bathroom. But, you know, the majority of it being glass. And I kept trying to argue with him about the problem of having a glass bedroom when your neighbors are about as far away as that wall is. And so he'd probably wind up with the curtains closed most of the time, which would eliminate the need for the glass and so forth and so on. And he was insistent that, you know, he had to have the glass. And I said, okay. So, and I had actually was trying to convince him of the idea that when you lie in bed, you're looking up. And Alvar Aalto had designed a hospital, which had really influenced me when I was an architect, when I was a student, where all the ceilings were painted, but the walls were not. Because, of course, all the patients lie in the bed looking up. And so I thought, well, you know, actually, this is a bedroom, so you're going to be lying on your bed, you're going to be looking up. Why don't we put a big oculus in the ceiling and allow the sun to come in the morning and the stars and the moon to be there at night? And of course, he's like, no, I don't want to do that. So I said, okay, I'd like you to go home tonight, lie in bed, and just imagine the stars and the moon through your ceiling. Imagine that moment of lying in the field in India and you're a child. And look, if it's not something you want to do, then that's fine. But come back and let's talk about it tomorrow. And I got a call the first thing the next morning, which was, this is great, we're doing it, let's do the Oculus. Make it really big. So there's the lesson for me, and this has been true, I think, all through my career, is that part of the value of design is that ability to get inside of who people are, what they do, what makes them tick, understanding the things which drive them, the things which scare them, the things which excite them, and finding a way to connect, to that kind of heart of who they are, and then to transform that into something which they would never have expected, something beyond their immediate imagination. Because if you can do those two things, you have quite a lot of power to do things, right? You earn the trust to be able to do great things. So, and the reason I wanted to talk about that is because I think actually, when I look at what the last 5 years of my journey at Morgan Stanley have been, it's exactly that process. Now, the problem is it's multiplied across a very large organization, and the complexities of the number of needs are intersecting at a much higher level. So you've got stakeholders, you've got users, you've got macro business environment, you've got technical constraints, you've got costs, you've got developers who may or may not be able to build because they don't necessarily have the right skills. You've got all the kinds of things that any large organization is fraught with. They are kind of like microcosms of society, right? And so how do you carve a path through that which guarantees that at every step of the way, you're delivering something which not only solves the immediate problem that you've been asked to solve, but earns you the trust and the respect to be able to do more than that, to push things a bit further, to create that oculus in the ceiling that people never would have imagined being great, but when they see it, they go, this is exactly what I didn't know I wanted. right? I mean, because to me, at the end of the day, that is great user experience. Whether you're, for any product that we do, there's the stuff which is nice, well done and well executed, and I'm not diminishing those things. But certainly when you're in what I would consider a sort of antagonistic environment, one in which you don't have receptive buyers, where you don't have teams of people who are just gushing to have you come in and say, do great things, and where they actually might have agendas which run counter to what you're trying to do, right? I mean, you actually have stakeholders who don't want things to change. You have users who want their jobs to be the same as they were before, who are terrified of being automated. You have developers who don't want to learn new skills, or who don't want to be shown up to not know how to do the thing that you're doing. There's like any number of personal, emotional kind of constraints which evolve into what we typically would term politics. But at the heart of them are really just human beings trying to negotiate their own lives inside of this organization, their own career, their own sense of safety. And there are a lot of people that are happy to compromise this thing, which, by the way, its failure could be blamed on budget, it could be blamed on stakeholders. There's a lot of people to point at when this thing doesn't go as well as you might like it to, and it isn't your fault, but it actually preserves your own position in some way, right? So the inertia inside of large organizations can be quite large, and for reasons which are intensely personal, and not always aimed against design or against good outcomes. So you have to use, I think, the skills that we have as designers, and that we always talk about: empathy for users, figuring out, all those personas, all those things that we do for the product. I actually think you have to do for the environment you are operating in. And that's true, I think, if I think about it, it's true. When I was doing that house, I had the developer had been hired on the assumption that the house was going to be something much closer to the Richard Neutra style thing, because at that point the client had those sorts of things in mind, and so he had priced it ahead of the curve, and this kind of we were building or designing into a kind of a cost envelope, which meant that the developer was very restrictive about what he was willing to build, and would go and do the usual thing, which I'm sure if you work with developers, is a similar sort of thing on the technology side, which is, ooh, I don't know, that's going to cost a lot, And of course, the client doesn't ever have any transparency about that. They don't know what it costs. They don't know. I mean, actually, with buildings, it's a little bit easier. You can kind of produce cut sheets. But when you're talking about software and a developer comes along and goes, yeah, that's a great idea, but that's going to add 6 months to the development life cycle. Who's going to disprove them, right? It becomes very challenging to then go back and say, well, I'm a designer, I don't write code, but he's, that's not true. So you have to kind of leverage other things. You have to find ways to kind of connect people. So I've kind of broken it down to what I consider to be sort of 4 things. So the first is how we work with others. Organizations are just people, collections of people doing things. So first and foremost, above everything, is you've got to tend to the way in which you operate with others. And I always kind of say it to my team, is be the best experience that anyone has with anyone else in the organization. Be the most professional, be the most fun, be the most exciting, be the most insightful, be the most transformative. When you go into a room, that first impression you make and the last impression when you leave the room, and when you start a project, when you finish a project, all the way through, everyone's experience should be, wow, I really like working with those UX guys. That is every time I get together with those guys, I learn something, or I get excited about something, or I'm reconnected. You have to attend to those things, right? That means knowing who those people are. That means spending time with them, not just treating them as a part of the team. But there's this sense of being empathetic with the group as a whole. I always say you have to play nicely with others. Sometimes work will not happen at the rate that you want it to happen. You can see where the answer should be, and it's not going to get there. So you then have to pivot and try and find another solution, which is not that, but which is also as good, can be as good. And that might mean making it smaller, it might mean putting it somewhere else. But there's this idea that you're always playing nicely with others to try and get them to be involved in helping to shape that. I also think beginning as you mean to go on. There's something about setting the expectations about how you're going to run a project, how you're going to engage with people. From the very beginning, people need to understand what that feels like. I do that everything from the point of engagement about saying, if you want us to get involved, here's what's needed for us to be successful. Here's what we need to help you be successful. And so the process is embedded in this notion of helping someone achieve their goals, and I stick to that. Because there's always friction. But those first few moments, that first workshop that you have with someone, sets the tone for how the entire relationship is going to unfold, right? It's not that it doesn't morph and change, but you're laying the groundwork. Invite everybody to the party, right? This is, if you're going to be involved in transformative work, it's going to impact lots of people. You want to get everyone in. Often there's some developer over in the corner who isn't there in the first meeting. There's somebody else, but we just want everyone in the room. We want to get them involved. They can choose to not be involved, right? Let them opt out. But try and make sure everyone's part of it. And then the other one is, being generous with your time and ideas. We spend a lot of time with people internally knowing that it's not going to go anywhere. But it doesn't matter, because what you're doing is you're kind of winning the hearts and the minds of an organization. They influence other people. And that notion of you are the best guys to work with becomes a kind of just a cultural meme that flows through the organization. And then it instantiates itself in the way in which you do work. So that's the first thing, is really attend to those things, tend to the relationships. From a work perspective, I think about the Oculus and the roof as a good example. The expectation, or even actually going, the expectation was I want a flat roof. There was no way no way he would ever imagined, an Oculus. And when I actually told him about it, he was like, no, there's no way it's going to be any good. And then of course, upon reflecting on it, he said, oh, this is amazing. And in fact, actually the experience when it was built was exactly that of what he imagined. So there's something about aiming high. The forces at work in an organization, the kind of forces of gravity are very, very great. So if you're aiming for your target, which is kind of what everybody expects, I guarantee you, the forces of gravity are going to pull you down into something lying on the ground below the target, which I don't need to mention. It's surrounded by flies. You definitely want to avoid that. So aim for the moon, get everyone aiming for the moon, but set that frame it, not that we're going to the moon, but that if we don't aim for the moon, we're not going to ever get to the target, right? And there's a way in which you can, when you're talking about stuff, you say, look, we're going to go off and think about crazy blue sky stuff. We're going to push the limits. I'm not suggesting that's what we're going to do, but we need to go there in order to be able to explore the full range of possibilities so that we can find the one that actually is feasible. If we jump straight to the solution that we all think is the right one or the one that's going to be the outcome, then we just compromise down from there, and that's not going to work. And that leads to the compromise. Don't ever compromise. Seriously, you need to decide that compromise is not on quality, on impact, is never a choice. It might mean that you have to change what you do. It might mean you have to walk away from something. It might mean you need to do various things. You make it smaller. But it should never be that, oh, well, we've got the really big idea, but it's so poorly executed. Because then what was the point? No one's ever going to see no one cares about the process, right? If you think about it, the end user experience is the thing I touch. Doesn't matter if you did tons of user research, doesn't matter if you did iterative process, it doesn't matter what you did. If the thing at the end is crap, then it's crap. It's that simple. And it's the same is true for the stuff that you're doing in any kind of an organization where you're trying to prove yourself, you have to make sure that the things you do are exceptionally good. And so there cannot be compromise in terms of the quality of the experience that you produce. There can be compromise in lots of other spaces, but not that. Because that's the only thing anyone will ever see. And by the way, that's what you'll get blamed for, right? So and of course that means attending to the details. It means being rigorous in your thinking and being rigorous in the process. You certainly have to take people on the journey, right? I think the process of teaching people what design is and how design works is essential. There are large parts of it that don't necessarily don't need to involve us, right? So I try and train the organization to be good at thinking from a customer perspective, thinking about personas, thinking about journeys, thinking about research, thinking about iteration. Because if I can get a team of 16,000 developers, doing that, maybe their work won't be as great as the work that I'm doing, but my team can't cover everything, right? But we at least lift everything, and we create a culture and a conversation around process that is much more design-centric than we would if it was just us doing it. So, and that, so that idea of teaching as you go. I also think it's important we run a small agency essentially inside of the organization. Different people operate in different ways. But I do think it's also, you need to pick the things that you want to be known for. One of the challenges around starting something in a large organization is you need a platform for success, right? Yeah. And so you need to pick something that, one, you think you can be successful at, but two, it has to be representative of the things that you want to be doing and what you want to be known for. And sometimes you have more or less choice over that. I've been quite lucky in that I've sort of go and shop around and sell our services and what we do across the firm, and so I can kind of help cherry pick that. And so you won't always have that, but I do think you need to be aware of what you think you want to be known for. Obviously, when it comes, the last two are building a team. This one I'll just speak very quickly on, which is you can put a lot of great people together in a room, and it doesn't mean you're going to get a great output, right? So I would say that everyone that's on my teams are extremely talented. I don't hire them for their talent, in the sense that talent is the hygiene factor in the interview process. I hire people who fit neatly with each other and form a culture which is partly about offsetting their skills. So it's about figuring out what gaps of skills and competencies do I have in my team and how do I fill those, but partly it's also just stylistically, how do they like to work? You know, there's a kind of rule in my team, which is there's no prima donnas. I expect everybody to be extremely good at what they do, but you know, we're designing very complex systems in very complex environments. There isn't room for prima donnas. Certainly, there are plenty of prima donnas in the organization, right? So we don't need to add more noise to that system. We should be the ones who are good at assimilating that, and we need to be able to collaborate, and we need to be able to share. And so there's a lot about building the right culture, rewarding integrity, rewarding excellence, you know, rewarding openness, rewarding generosity of time, and so forth, knowing what motivates people. The last one is obviously around influencing an organization, and this one was a hard one for me to come by, but it was my own experience, which is that no one buys design. No one cares about design. It's a real blow for anyone who spent their career building up, you know, I'm a designer, this is what I do, look at how great design is, and you're trying to sell design in an organization. No one cares. And when I look back in my career, no one has ever cared about design. What they care about is the results that they're trying to get to, and design has somewhere in their universe become the method or one of the methods by which they'll get there. So, you know, for instance, I sell efficiency or cost reduction or whatever it might be. But so the question is, how do you frame that? Well, you frame it by going back to the very beginning, which is, who are these people? What are they looking for? What challenges do they have? And you frame the problem from the perspective of, you know, if that's the problem you're trying to solve, and this is the concerns that you have, and this is what you feel makes you successful, here are the ways in which this thing that I have, called design, will solve that. So you reframe design from the perspective, again, it's a customer-centric way of talking about what we do. And then at the end, they will be excited by design in and of itself. But in the first instance, they're not buying design, right? So they're buying that. And then the last one is, I would just say, is, you know, actually two things. One is connect the dots, right? You know, the future's already here in most organizations, just unevenly distributed, right? So, you know, a lot of it's about being an innovation distributor. You kind of find a spot over here that's working really well, and you kind of find other people that might benefit from that. If you become the connective tissue that links success to success, then people start to see you as the people who are able to generate success, you know, around the organization. They see you as the bridge. They see it as the bridge between teams, as the bridge between ideas, and so you have this ability to sort of maneuver horizontally across the organization, distributing kind of great ideas and great solutions. And then the other is, obviously, you have to play the long game. This is not like consulting where someone comes in, you've got 6 months, you deliver something, and if it isn't exactly what you set out to do, by the time you close the deal and you walk away, that's it, you're never getting the job again. Actually, you can gracefully fail in controlled ways and work over a longer time horizon. And you have to figure that out pretty early about at what point, and you're constantly kind of negotiating whether or not, okay, do we really push hard on this to get that, or do we reframe it, make it small so we can deliver excellence so that we win some more people to get to the next stage. And I think the long game is probably the bit which has been the hardest for me to, as a, you know, being impatient with getting the kind of outputs that I would want. The long game has been the hardest thing to do, but actually in the end, it's actually the thing which has allowed us to have, take a company which is largely knew nothing about design and make design now kind of central to the way in which they think about getting certainly the innovative parts of our transformation done. Most of the big projects will not happen now without having the UX team involved, which is pretty transformative for a fairly large financial organization. So that's it. Thank you.